So, the technology of the watchers. In my dreams, when people were watching primitives or animals, it was necessary to have technology to protect themselves. So first of all, there's the technology used to create a barrier. This would be used to prevent people and animals going somewhere they were not wanted. They looked like thick washers, or polo mints, or maybe lifesaver mints, depending on what country you're in. A series of these little devices can create a sound barrier, an outer-facing barrier, that discourages any person or animal from getting close. If a large circle, so if you wanted something encircled, was required, then a large number of the devices were needed. When activated, they simply generated a harmless sound that repelled. So the technology to talk about was a hat. Yep, you heard it right, a hat. Okay, well, let's call it a headdress. It provided for the collection and the holding of ambient energy that was required for some of the other devices. So often the watchers were outside of locations where the ambient energy was available. So think ley lines and Tesla. Another aspect that it provided was the monitoring and reacting to environmental threats. It also did light, recording. It provided cranial protection like a motorbike helmet. And strangely enough, it covered the hair. Many Atlanteans had red hair, and for some reason, that often scared primitives. So, what did it actually look like? Well, the hat itself came in whatever design that the person preferred. So some hats had a simple upside-down bucket-like look about them, whereas others, they chose something more shapely and even more interesting. But no matter what style, the base was solid. It was providing protection, and the consistency of the items were what was on the hat. So what was on the hat? Okay, it was coils or tubes that were wound around the hat, and this was the part of it that collected, held, and provided energy. So that was for when you were out in the wildlands and where there was often no access. So the tubes could be in different shapes. Often they were quite similar, and some even had a bit of a snake-like look to them. And the last part of the ensemble was that an item could be clipped to the front or to the top of the hat. And that item would provide light or recording or protection. It had a multifunction. And the protection basically was, for example, if any rapid movement by any animate object occurred, the item would cause a temporary harmless stun for an animal or primitive, and that was to ensure that if something was attacking, and it was attacking quickly, it wouldn't be so quick as to prevent the Atlantean from being protected. So if they didn't have time to react, the hat reacted. And the item that did that had to stick out from the headdress. So it either stuck out at the front or it stuck out on top. It tended to be oval or round and slightly curved. Not massively curved, but just sort of, it's kind of hard to describe. Yeah, it was curved. Okay, as an aside, I noticed that in Egypt, there are two symbols that appear on headdresses. One is a snake and the other is a vulture. The funny thing to me is that both the snake and the vulture have a similar kind of look to this device that was clipped into the hat. And it's like almost as if two different cultures were looking at the same item, and one of them saw a snake shape and the other one saw a vulture head shape. And then the two cultures got together, and instead of combining them, they put both of them on their hats to copy what they thought they saw. The next aspect of the protection are the wrist and arm bands. And this is quite a big subject because these were always worn by Atlanteans, and they were in different styles. Some looked like a flower, others looked like little striped bands, or coloured bands around the wrists. Anyway, they served many purposes, from the telling of time through to the control of specific devices and to providing a variety of information. So what I'm going to talk about today is just the bits that are relevant to the protection of watches. So these items operated and communicated to their user with colours and symbols, and some of the control mechanisms were from simple hand positions. They looked like flowers in some cases and bands in others, but whatever the shape or style used, it was the colour that was important. So the colours of the petals of the flowers would change, or the stripes or the bands would change in some way. So an important feature that linked the headdress to the protection devices for the watchers was if you placed one of those bands on top of the other. So let's say you took one hand and you put the underside flower of one hand on top of the top side flower on another, so you can imagine the position that would be in. So that was essentially placing one band on top of the other. It becomes in an arm crossed position. So that immediately initiates a person's defensive control mechanisms. So the arms crossed in front of the chest is hence a position that is more often than not required whenever an Atlantean encountered a primitive. So it's just interesting that primitives would see Atlanteans and Atlanteans would have their arms crossed in front of them. And it's kind of only to be expected that a primitive would assume that whenever they see an Atlantean, that's the position they have their hands in, which isn't true. That's only when they met primitives. But it's interesting how the primitive interpreted what they saw. Atlanteans, Tantals, always tried to look like the people they were visiting as much as possible. So if a culture only respected men, which was quite common in those days, then Atlanteans would always dress as men, even if they were women. And this included wearing whatever type of beards that were popular or fashionable in the culture. So false beards were very useful for disguise, or because they had the ability to amplify a voice. So when an Atlantean wanted to speak to a crowd, the voice could boom. Egyptians were smart enough to realize the beards were false, and they obviously thought that it was a feature, as one would say today.